Welcome to part 3A of the lectures for weeks 3 and 4. So you're going to want to watch this particular portion, part 3A, after you've already watched part 3. And after part 3A comes part 4. So in this chunk of the lectures, we're going to talk about mechanisms of evolutionary change other than natural selection. By the end of this portion of the lectures, you will need to know what migration or gene flow is. You'll need to be able to define mutation, which chances are you already know about what mutation is. You're also going to need to be able to talk about genetic drift, the bottleneck effect and the founder effect, and you will need to be able to provide an evolutionary hypothesis explaining why Joffrey Baratheon from Game of Thrones is an evil psychopath. Moving right along. One last question. What is a deme? You'll need to know what a deme is by the end of the lecture. So far, we've learned about two forces of evolution that lead to change over time within species. So what are they? Can you name them? Okay, ideally you can, and they are natural and sexual selection. So we're now going to answer the questions of where variation comes from and why some genes increase or decrease in frequency independent of things like increased survivorship or reproductive success. In other words, we're going to learn about mechanisms of evolutionary change that are not natural or sexual selection and which could not have been understood in Darwin's day. The frequencies of different alleles in a population can be shifted by 4 mechanisms. We've already learned about natural selection and sexual selection, which is often thought of as a sub-mechanism. So sexual selection is often thought of as a sub-mechanism of natural selection. Now we're going to discuss the other 3, and here they are on the screen. So we'll first talk about mutation. Mutation introduces new variation into populations. Mutations are spontaneous changes in the structure of a gene, and they are essential to evolution. Every genetic feature in every organism was initially the result of a mutation. The new genetic variant, or allele, spreads via reproduction, and the fact that not all organisms reproduce equally or have the same number of offspring is a defining aspect of evolutionary change. It's easy to understand how a mutation that allows an organism to feed, grow, or reproduce more effectively could cause the mutant allele to become more abundant over time. A mutation that occurs in cells which become sperm or eggs, in other words, a mutation that will be passed down to offspring, is called a germline mutation. Germline mutation. A harmful germline mutation causes genetic diseases. A beneficial one confers a trait that helps offspring to survive and reproduce. This image shows 2 adaptive mutations in humans, although one has some significant drawbacks. You have already learned about this mutation, which gave rise to sickle cell anemia. It is protective against malaria, but it also causes pain and injury. The EPAS1 gene variant is found in nearly all Tibetans. It confers physiological traits that allow individuals to thrive in low oxygen, high altitude environments. The women in this image herd yaks in an area that is nearly 3 miles above sea level. We will learn more about this gene, also referred to as the super athlete gene, later in these lectures. So don't worry, you don't have to know all this information about EPAS1 just yet. We're going to review it in depth in a later segment of the lectures. Evolution is simply not possible without random genetic change for its raw material. All right, so let's now talk about gene flow, which is also known as migration. And it's basically exactly what it sounds like. Humans actually aren't very genetically diverse. That is, there is not much genetic difference that separates us no matter what our racial or ethnic identities are. Depending on where our ancestors evolved, we have some specific gene variants that helped our lineages to survive in those particular environments. So that's really the basis for all difference observed across different populations of humans. We will talk about these types of adaptations later in the lecture, and you've already learned about them in the videos on lactase persistence, sickle cell anemia, and skin color. Migration of humans all over the world has led to the introduction of these gene variants into new populations. This is an example of gene flow. In this slide, there are images of Americans who identify as Blaxican or Black and Mexican. They represent unique mixtures of African, indigenous Mexican, and in some cases, European genetics. Now we will learn about two mechanisms of change that don't always lead to positive changes in populations. They are both forms of genetic drift, which has a large effect in small populations and can reduce genetic variation. Genetic drift also increases the difference between different populations of the same species. The best examples of genetic drift in humans are observed in our early origins and in cults, religious minority or extremist groups, and populations who have either self-isolated or been marginalized and isolated by the larger society of which they were once a part. The bottleneck effect is seen after a disaster-type event greatly reduces the size of a population. The resulting reduced population can have much less genetic variability than the original large population. An animal example of the bottleneck effect that happened relatively recently in history has to do with elephant seals. Have you ever been to Año Nuevo near Half Moon Bay? If not, add it to your list of Bay Area staycation destinations. Each year from December 15 to March 31st, elephant seal breeding season takes place and up to 10,000 elephant seals make their way to the beach. This population was hunted to the brink of extinction by European settlers in the late 19th century. After protective measures were thankfully introduced, the population rebounded to more than 30,000. Why is this not an entirely happy story? The bottle with the marbles provides a visual example of what happens when populations are reduced and then bounce back. The proportions of different alleles, aka the yellow and the blue marbles, can change, such that less genetic diversity is present in the new population. As you now know, natural selection requires variation, and it is impossible for species to adapt without underlying genetic variation. Elephant seals are highly susceptible to being wiped out by a disease or other catastrophic change in their environment. According to geneticists at Stanford University, an intense bottleneck in human males, which occurred between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, can be detected in modern human DNA. This event led to a decline in male population size down to about 1/20th of its original level in earlier millennia in regions including Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. A male population bottleneck occurred during this time because of warfare and competition between males, who were battling for access to wealth and resources. At this time in human history, hunting and gathering had begun to be replaced by farming and sedentary lifestyles, which enabled people to acquire more material wealth and therefore power over others. Material inequality and social inequality, in which some males gained higher status than others, appears to have increased competition and violence amongst males. In this case, genetically related males likely fought for access to familial wealth and power, leading to entire lineages of males being wiped out. For the founder effect, Think about the genetic consequences of reproducing in an isolated social context over many generations. Cults, religious minority groups, and others. If one or more members of a small breeding group happen to be a carrier of a rare genetic disorder, this rare trait will, over many generations, become amplified. A high percentage of BRCA mutation carriers have been found in populations characterized by the founder effect. The founder effect is a phenomenon caused by so-called inbreeding, or the mating of individuals that are genetically closely related or blood relatives. This has occurred in populations that live in isolation due to geographical or religious separation from mainstream societies. Through continuous inbreeding, the founder effect takes place, based on partial loss of genetic variability in a new population developed from a small number of individuals. If a disease-causing mutation was present in this small number of founders, or the original members of this small group, the expression of harmful genes will be increased in their descendants. For example, this happened in populations like the Ashkenazi Jews, characterized by a high percentage of BRCA1 mutation carriers, and in Icelandic people, where an abnormal number of BRCA2 mutations is found. Ashkenazi Jews historically practiced endogamy, or cultural emphasis on marriage only within individuals of the same ethnic background, and they were also persecuted and marginalized before and during World War II. For these reasons, rare genetic disorders became more common in this population. Why has Tay-Sachs, a terrible disease that kills babies and toddlers, persisted in Ashkenazi genomes? It is believed that being a carrier for Tay-Sachs confers some resistance to tuberculosis. Ashkenazi Jews throughout Europe were historically subject to laws and social policy that kept them in poverty and living in crowded, less sanitary parts of cities. The word ghetto has origins in Nazi policies to isolate Jewish populations into less desirable areas of European cities where higher rates of tuberculosis occurred. Another example of the negative impacts of the founder effect can be observed in Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome in Amish populations. Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome results in short stature, also known as dwarfism. People with this condition have particularly short forearms and lower legs, and a narrow chest with short ribs. Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome is also characterized by the presence of extra fingers and toes, a condition known as polydactyly, malformed fingernails and toenails, dental abnormalities, and sometimes heart defects. This rare genetic disorder is more common in the Old Order Amish population than it is anywhere else in the world. The Amish represent a collection of different demes, or genetically closed communities that originated from a small group of people who migrated to the US from Switzerland and Germany. There is some good news on the genetic front for Amish folks, however. On average, they live 10% longer than people in the general US population, and it appears that they have an anti-aging mutation in a particular gene that allows them to live longer and healthier lives. Let's talk about one last example of the founder effect. Now, this is a fictional example, just to let you know. Dr. Mohammed Noor, a professor of biology at Duke University, not pictured in this slide, says that Game of Thrones offers useful lessons for understanding rules of inheritance. In the following quotation, he explains how the evil psychopath, Joffrey Lannister/Baratheon, may actually be a victim of the founder effect. According to Noor, some of our personality traits and behaviors have a genetic component, and here I'm quoting Dr. Noor. For example, a 2018 study in translational psychiatry mapped some genes potentially associated with empathy in humans. Imagine that Joffrey's grandfather, Tywin Lannister, had a bad mutation in one of his 2 copies of a gene affecting empathy. Tywin himself may exhibit normal behavior, debatable whether this is the case, since Tywin's other copy of the gene functions normally. Tywin may well pass along the broken copy of an empathy gene to his kids, Cersei and Jaime Lannister. Again, they may exhibit normal behavior. Again, debatable, especially for Cersei, because the copy they got from their mom functions normally. However, if Cersei and Jaime have a kid with each other, there's a 25% chance that the kid will get 2 broken copies of the gene affecting empathy. That kid might then exhibit a psychiatric disorder like an extreme lack of empathy. Sounds like Joffrey. I should note that this is all speculation, but it's a reasonable hypothesis.